start. Yes, I got it. All right, everybody. Hello, hello, hello. Happy New Year to everyone. Welcome to the first Skeptical Inquirer Presents of 2022. Very exciting. It is Clean Up Your Computer Month. And I happened to do that last month when I spilled a bottle of water on my laptop. But thank you all for your heartfelt condolences on the loss of my former laptop. It is also National Take Down Your Christmas Tree Day. In my house, we call that Valentine's Day, but whatever. And if you're here in the United States, Unhappy Insurrection Day. Are we doing that? I don't know, but on the bright side, events like that make shows like this even more important, because this is a series of live online presentations from experts who are devoted to advancing science over pseudoscience, media literacy over conspiracy theories, and of course, critical thinking over magical thinking. My name is Leanne Lord, and I really am delighted to be your host. I am a stand-up comedian, and you can see me in action on Even More Funny Women of a Certain Age, which is streaming right now on Showtime. I'm also co-host for the Point of Inquiry podcast. It's available wherever you get your audio joy. And the last episode features an interview with Carl Zimmer talking about his new book, Life's Edge: The Search for What It Means to Be Alive. Now, I have my own theory, which usually entails me screaming with fear and exhilaration at the tippity top of a roller coaster. Your mileage, of course, may vary. Now, if you haven't already, I encourage you to subscribe to Skeptical Inquirer magazine. The print edition gives you access to the digital. You can get either or both if you're smart at skepticalinquirer.org. Now, let's see. I think we are going to move right into this. I will invite you all to sit back and relax. If you're not from around these parts, let me assure you that tonight's format is easy breezy. I'll introduce our guest. They'll razzle and dazzle you, I'm sure. And after that, we'll open it up for your questions. Now, at the bottom of your screen, I know all of you know this, but I just want to make sure you'll see that there's an icon that says Q&A, and that's the place for you to type your questions in the form of a question. I can see one interrupted. Two of you have already popped in there. If it's when's my birthday, it's September 2nd. And I don't limit myself to the calendar year. I accept presents all year long. Now, if you miss any of the talk tonight, it is being recorded and will be available on skepticalinquirer.org. Now, our guest this evening is the Harvard College Professor of Psychology at Harvard University, a two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist, and the winner of many awards for his research, teaching, and books. He's been named one of Time's 100 most influential people. FYI, I just missed the cutoff for that at 101, but that's okay. He's also one of foreign policy's 100 leading global thinkers. And if we define global as hyperlocal, as in my house, then, I'm right up there too. No, I'm not. His books include The Stuff of Thought, The Better Angels of Our Nature, The Blank Slate, and The Sense of Style. I'd also like to add that our guest has a really cool podcast called Think with Pinker. I'm enjoying on this show. I really can't think of a better way to kick off the new year. And so please welcome the author of Rationality. And I have a copy here, what it is, why it seems scarce, and why it matters. I'm delighted to say the words, Captain Steven Pinker, you have the con, sir.
Thank you so much, Leanne. Live long, may you live long and prosper. It is a tremendous honor to speak to at an event hosted by the Center for Inquiry at a Skeptical Inquirer Presents, because I have been a subscriber to the magazine, I believe, for pretty much as long as it has existed. I read an article about its founding in the Boston Globe when I was an undergraduate student in the 1970s. I immediately took out a subscription. And then a few years later, I was an assistant professor. I was nobody, no one had heard from me, but I wrote to the board of the, at that time it was called the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, CSICOP. I think it morphed into the Center for Inquiry, offering to be added to their list of scientific consultants as an experimental psychologist. To my surprise and delight, I got a letter back from the amazing Randy on the amazing Randy's own letterhead, welcoming me to the board. I have kept it ever since, one of my prized possessions. And so at least 40 years later, it is an honor to be able to speak at an event organized by the Center for Inquiry. I'm happy to speak about my latest book, Rationality, because rationality presents us with a puzzle. On the one hand, our species has achieved magnificent feats of rationality. We have figured out how to walk on the moon and take pictures of our home planet, to plumb the mysteries of the cosmos, of life, and of mind. We have fought back against the four horsemen of the apocalypse and reduced the human toll from war, from famine, from poverty, from early death. At the same time, a majority of Americans between the ages of 18 and 24 think that astrology is very or sort of scientific. Large proportions believe in conspiracy theories, such as that COVID vaccines are a subterfuge by Bill Gates to implant microchips into our bodies, that the American deep state houses a cabal of Satan-worshiping cannibalistic pedophiles. Many people swallow fake news, like Obama signs executive order banning the Pledge of Allegiance in schools nationwide. Or Yoko Ono, I had an affair with Hillary Clinton in the 1970s. And many of us believe in paranormal woo-woo, including possession by the devil, extrasensory perception, ghosts and spirits, witches, and spiritual energy in mountains, trees, and crystals. And it's, in fact, the persistence of these beliefs that take us back to the 1970s that originally prompted the Skeptical Inquirer magazine and the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, and they are still with us. This is the puzzle I tried to deal with in Rationality: what it is, why it seems scarce, and why it matters. Well, let's begin at the beginning. What is rationality? I define it as the use of knowledge to attain goals. But let me be a bit more concrete and allude to my favorite psychologist, the namesake of the building that I work in at Harvard, the great philosopher and psychologist William James, who tried to put his finger on the difference between an entity that we would all be willing to credit with rationality and one that was superficially similar, but that we would all agree was not so rational. Here's how he puts the difference. Romeo wants Juliet as the filings want the magnet. And if no obstacles intervene, he moves toward her by as straight a line as they. But Romeo and Juliet, if a wall be built between them, do not remain idiotically presenting their faces against the opposite sides like the magnet and filings with the card. Romeo soon finds a circuitous way, by scaling the wall or otherwise, of touching Juliet's lips directly. With the filings, the path is fixed. Whether it reaches the end depends on accidents. With a lover, it is the end which is fixed. The path may be modified indefinitely. That's rationality. It raises the question, okay, well, how can knowledge be used to attain goals? And the general answer is by appeal to normative models. That is, models of how we ought to think, how we ought to reason, what will, in fact, bring us our goals. And a good part of Rationality, the book, consists of chapters that try to explain what I think are the normative models that all educated people should master. Beginning with logic, which helps us pursue the goal of deducing new propositions from existing ones. Each one of the normative models helps us to avoid a family of fallacies. In the case of logic, for example, we can avoid the fallacy of affirming the consequent, such as every creative genius was laughed at his time. People laugh at my ideas, therefore I'm a creative genius. Probability. The likelihood of an event depends on the number of occurrences as a proportion of the number of opportunities. Appreciating that helps us to avoid fallacies like the availability bias, in which the subjective likelihood of an event depends on how easily you can recall anecdotes and images. Illustrated in the following SMBC cartoon, captioned, "This is why people should learn statistics. I will not fly in a plane. They aren't safe from terrorists. Hold on, I'll text you an article about it." Bayes' rule. We should give credence to a hypothesis to the extent that it's credible a priori, it's consistent with the evidence, and the evidence is uncommon across the board. That helps us avoid fallacies like base rate neglect, as in the advisory that a doctor gave to a person that I know. Your child has a nervous switch, so she probably has Tourette syndrome, ignoring the fact that twitches are very common and Tourette syndrome is quite rare. The theory of rational choice. A rational actor should choose the option with the greatest expected utility, that is, the probability multiplied by the payoff. And that helps us avoid fallacies like buying extended warranties. They cost about a quarter of the price of the product. A majority of Americans buy them, which makes no sense unless your product breaks down more than 25% of the time. Does it really make sense to buy a health insurance policy for your toaster? Probably not. The theory of signal detection or error management. A fallible observer can't know whether an observation is real, that is a signal, or bogus, that is noise. Excuse me. And must set a decision cutoff that trades off misses and false alarms according to their costs. That helps us to avoid fallacies such as the following. We should deal with misconduct by making it easier to convict the accused, which is another way of saying we should punish more innocent people. Game theory. How do you make rational choices when the payoffs depend on someone else's rational choices? And appreciation of that can help us avoid fallacies like the tragedy of the commons. We can avoid climate change if we just convince everyone that it's in their best interest to conserve. The problem is it's not in anyone's best interest to conserve. It would mean that they would be shivering in the winter and sweating in the summer and standing in the rain to catch a bus while everyone else drives or turns their thermostat up or down. It is rational only if everyone else makes the same decision at the same time. Indeed, every country makes the same decision at the same time. And causal inference. To distinguish correlation from causation, one has to manipulate the putative cause, holding all else constant. And that helps us avoid fallacies like failing to rule out confounds. My favorite example comes from an old Jewish joke in which a sexually unfulfilled couple approaches their rabbi for advice, because it is written in Jewish law that a man is responsible for his wife's sexual satisfaction. Well, the rabbi strokes his beard, thinks for a while, and he says, well, here's an idea. Why don't you hire a young, handsome, strapping man to wave a towel over you the next time you make love, and the fantasies will help the missus achieve satisfaction. Well, they try it out. They hire a handsome young man, and he waves the towel, and nothing happens. They go back to the rabbi. He thinks, he strokes his beard again. He says, well, this time let's try a slight variation. This time, have the man make love to the wife, and you, the husband, will wave the towel. Well, they try that, and sure enough, she reaches an earth-moving, screaming orgasm. And the husband says to the man, schmuck. Now, that's the way you wave a towel. That's an example of failing to rule out a confound. Well, all of these normative models raise the question of how well do mortal human beings, you and I, follow these normative models, that is, reason as we ought to. Let me give you an example, a couple of examples from the psychology lab. Here's an example from logic. Consider the rule, every card has a number on one side and a letter on the other. Here's a possible rule. If a card has a D on one side, then it has a D on the other. Which of the following cards do you have to turn over to test whether the rule is in effect, that if-then conditional? We've got a D, we've got an F, we've got a 3, we've got a 7. Now, most people, and this experiment has been done for more than 50 years, replicates very well. Almost everyone picks the D and the 3. Now, but when you think about it, the correct answer is you have to turn over the D and the 7. How come? Well, everyone agrees you've got to turn over the D, because if you turn over a D and there isn't a 3 on the other side, that would falsify the rule. That's easy. Almost everyone knows you don't have to turn over the F. It doesn't matter, it doesn't say anything about an F one way or another. As I mentioned, a lot of people, close to a majority, say you have to turn over the 3. But when you think about it, that is irrelevant, because the rule says if D, then 3, not if 3, then D. They're actually committing the fallacy of affirming the consequent. And when you think about it, you really do have to turn over the 7, because if you turned over the 7 and you found that it had a D on the other side, it would violate the rule. If there's a D on one side, there's a 7 on the other. What's going on? Well, one explanation is that this is the phenomenon of confirmation bias, that people seek out evidence that confirms their beliefs, but they don't put in the same effort to look for evidence that might falsify their hypotheses. Let me give you another example from the psychology lab. This one comes from Bayesian Inference, Bayes' rule. The probability that a woman has breast cancer is 1%. If a woman does have breast cancer, the probability that she will test positive is 90%. That's the sensitivity of the test. If she doesn't have breast cancer, the probability that she nevertheless tests positive is 9%. That's the false positive rate. A woman tests positive. What is the chance that she actually has the disease? Now, the most popular answer in a sample of doctors is 80 to 90%. The correct answer, according to Bayes' rule, is 9%. That's a big difference, and consider your reaction if a doctor faced explaining a positive result to you said that there's a 90% chance that you have cancer, whereas the chance is really 9%. Well, and the common explanation is that there is a syndrome in human probabilistic judgment known as base rate neglect. Namely, people ignore the priors, the prior probability, the base rate in the population, and they base judgments on representative stereotypes. What do these fallacies show? Well, Leanne reminded us of the prototype of reasoning, Mr. Spock, who concluded many times humans are irrational. But not so fast. Let me say a few words in defense of my fellow Homo sapiens. Here's a twist on the logic problem. If a bar patron is drinking beer, he must be over 21. Consider that rule. You're a bouncer, and you got to enforce it. Which of the following do you check? There's a guy drinking beer. Do you have to card him to find out how old he is? There's a guy drinking Coke. Do you have to card him to find out how old he is? There's a guy who's obviously over 21. Do you have to peer into his cup to see what he's drinking? And there's a guy who's clearly under 21. Do you have to peer into his cup to see what he's drinking? Well, this time, everyone gets it right. Everyone knows you've got to card the guy who's drinking beer. You've got to look into the cup of the guy who's clearly under 21. That is, they turn over the D card, they turn over the 7 card, the P and the not Q card options, exactly as logic says they should. It's sometimes called the content effect, that even though it is true that people are often illogical with abstract symbols, with certain kinds of meaningful content, like obligations and precautions, they can be perfectly sound logicians. Here's a twist on the probability problem. 10 in every 1,000 women have breast cancer. Of these 10 women, 9 will test positive. Of the 990 women without breast cancer, about 89 of them will nonetheless test positive. A woman tests positive, what is the chance that she actually has breast cancer? Well, now people can think, oh, gee, well, all in all, 98 people test positive. Of those, you just told us that 9 have cancer. Clearly, the answer is 9 out of 98, about 9%. Now, not only do doctors get it right, but even a majority of 10-year-olds presented with the problem in this way suddenly think like good Bayesian statisticians. An explanation is that we are all intuitively pretty good with natural frequencies, that is, with actual countable entities as we might come across them in our everyday experience. We're not so good with the somewhat mysterious concept of the probability of a single event. That is, the probability that that particular person has cancer. There, people will tend to fall back on representativeness and other stereotypes. So a better conclusion about human rationality is that we do use ecological rationality. This has nothing to do with being green or hugging a tree, but rather that people can reason about content that's relevant to their everyday lives, mixed together with their subject matter knowledge. They can estimate probabilities as they encounter sequences of events. People are not so good when it comes to formal rationality, the kind you learn in school. They haven't mastered the abstract rules and formulas that can apply to any content across the board, no matter how familiar or unfamiliar. Well, all this now leads to the question that this is the most frequently asked question that I entertain when I tell people that first I was teaching a course, then writing a book on rationality. If people can be rational, why does humanity seem to be losing its mind? How do you explain the conspiracy theories and the fake news and the paranormal woo-woo? It's not an easy question to answer, and I offer 4 reasons. The first is another phenomenon well documented from the psychology lab called motivated reasoning. Now, remember that rationality is always in service of a goal. That goal is not necessarily objective truth. It can also be to win an argument in which the stakes matter to you. As Upton Sinclair noted, it is hard to convince a man of something when, or hard to get a man to understand something when his livelihood depends on not understanding it. It could be to show how wise and moral your group is, and your religion, your tribe, your political sect, and how stupid and evil the opposing one is. Called the my side bias for obvious reasons, possibly the most robust and powerful of the cognitive biases. And it could be to gain status and to avoid ostracism as a hero rather than a traitor of your own side. Let me give you an example of how this can be demonstrated. I'm going to ask you whether this syllogism is valid, whether the conclusions follow from the premises. If college admissions are fair, then affirmative action laws are no longer necessary. College admissions are not fair, therefore affirmative action laws are necessary. Now, in fact, this is a fallacious inference. It is not a valid syllogism. It embodies the fallacy of denying the antecedent. P implies Q, not P, therefore not Q. That is not logically valid. It turns out that a majority of liberals commit the fallacy and conservatives, however, do not. Now, if you ask a conservative for his explanation, they say, well, just as we told you all along, liberals are illogical. Not so fast. Here's another syllogism. If less severe punishments deter people from committing crime, then capital punishment should not be used. Less severe punishments do not deter people from committing crime, therefore capital punishment should be used. Well, as you could probably predict, this time conservatives commit the fallacy, liberals don't. What happens is that both groups are quick to ratify a chain of reasoning that leads to a conclusion that they wanted to believe was true all along. Whether the logical steps actually are valid is less important than that the conclusion is one that they are already committed to. A second part of the explanation comes down to basic intuitions, ways in which we all make sense of the world, probably our legacy from evolution. For example, most people have some intuition of dualism. A person has a body and a person has a mind. Well, from there, it's a short step to think there could be minds without bodies. And so you have belief in spirits and souls and ghosts and afterlife and reincarnation and ESP. There's the intuition of essentialism, by which we make sense of living things, that living things contain some kind of invisible essence that gives them their form and their powers. From there, it's a short step to think that disease is caused by some kind of adulteration or pollution of one's essence by the introduction of a foreign contaminant. And so you get resistance to vaccines, which after all consist of actually injecting a portion of the very pathogen that gives you the disease into the flesh and blood of your body, and of genetically modified organisms, which are seen as adulterants or contaminants. And it leads people to embrace homeopathy and herbal remedies as potential cures, restoring the healthful essence. It also leads to the widespread invention, and this has taken place in many cultures, of purging and bloodletting and fasting and getting rid of toxins, whatever they are, as a pseudo-scientific form of treatment. That is, you purge the body of these foreign contaminants. And we all harbor the intuition of teleology. We know that our plans and artifacts are designed with a purpose. From there, it's a short step to think that the universe is designed with a purpose. And so for people to harbor beliefs in creationism and astrology and synchronicity, and the vague intuition that everything happens for a reason. A third part of the explanation: our basic intuitions are unlearned, and objective truths are acquired only by trusting legitimate expertise: scientists, historians, journalists, government officials. Few of us can actually justify our beliefs, even the true ones. Not very few of us know enough climate science to really lay out the case for human-made global warming and climate change. And in fact, in tests of scientific literacy, it turns out that creationists and climate deniers are no less scientifically literate than believers. In fact, if you ask people who do endorse the scientific consensus on climate change, what's the cause, you'll get cockamamie answers like, well, it doesn't have something to do with the ozone hole or toxic waste dumps or plastic straws in the ocean. People have this vague sense of green, and many do not understand the mechanisms. They just assume that the people in the white coats have figured it all out and are closer to the truth. What does predict how much people endorse human-made climate change is just their political ideology. The farther they are to the right, the more denial. Weird beliefs persist in people who don't trust the establishment, who consider them to be just any old clique or priesthood that they can blow off as easily as anyone else. The final piece of the puzzle, I think, is that there's a distinction between what I call realist beliefs and mythological beliefs. When you pose the question, why do people believe outlandish fake news and conspiracy theories? Part of the answer is, depends what you mean by believe. People hold two kinds of beliefs, I think. There are beliefs in the reality zone. These are the physical cause and effect that impinges on our lives, the people that we deal with face to face, the memory of our interactions with them. And when it comes to beliefs in the zone, people are pretty rational. They hold that beliefs in the zone are testable and that you should only believe them if they're true. And that has to be the case, because reality is what doesn't go away when you stop believing in it. And you couldn't very well keep food in the fridge and gas in the car and turn up for your job and pay your taxes and get the kids clothed and fed and off to school on time unless you respected the laws of cause and effect in reality. At the same time, there's also a zone that does not impinge on our day-to-day lives: the distant past, the unknowable future, faraway peoples and places, remote corridors of power, what really happens in the White House and corporate boardrooms, the microscopic, the cosmic, the counterfactual, the metaphysical. Here, people hold beliefs because they're entertaining, they're uplifting, they're empowering, they deliver the right moral. Whether they are true or false, you can't find out anyway, and it's kind of irrelevant. You believe them because of their moral uplift. Examples are religion, national myths, historical fiction, and I submit fake news and conspiracy theories. Let's take Pizzagate, the predecessor of QAnon, according to which Hillary Clinton ran a child sex ring in the basement of a Washington, D.C. pizzeria. A typical response among believers in this theory was to like, leave a one-star review on Yelp. Uh, that an example being, well, the pizza dough was incredibly underbaked and weird-looking men gave suspicious looks to my 5-year-old son. Now, that's not the kind of response that you would have if you literally thought that children were being raped in the basement. Like, you might call the police if you believed it was literally happening. So it raises the question, what does "I believe that Hillary Clinton ran a child sex ring" really mean to these people? Well, it kind of means, I think she's so depraved that she's capable of doing that, whether or not she does, and who's to say she doesn't. In fact, probably a good summary of that belief would be, boo, Hillary. Beliefs, in other words, can simply be expressions of moral convictions. When Bertrand Russell said it is undesirable to believe a proposition when there is no ground whatsoever for supposing it is true, he was not expressing some obvious, boring, trite, banal truism. This is a radical manifesto, and it does not apply to most people when it comes to beliefs in zones remote from their day-to-day existence. Well, how can we become more rational? For starters, the tools of formal rationality, the normative models, should become second nature. Rationality should be the fourth R in school, together with reading, writing, and arithmetic. Second, the norms of rationality should be promoted as part of our common currency. People should be aware of common fallacies like availability, like my side, like arguing ad hominem. And there should be a general ethic or norm, to the extent that we can spread it, that you should base your beliefs on evidence. You should change your mind when the evidence changes, and that changing your mind when the evidence changes is a sign of strength, not weakness. And of course, needless to say, these are precisely the norms that the Center for Inquiry and Skeptical Inquirer magazine has been promoting for decades. We can all hope that they put themselves out of business, but sadly, it has not happened yet. Third, institutions with their rationality promoting rules must be safeguarded. That is, we all have to submit to a game whose rules allow one person to notice and make up for another person's biases, which can make us collectively more rational than any of us is individually. Let me just give you a concrete example. When it comes to that card selection task, if D then 3, when people work alone, as I mentioned, very few people get it right, 1 in 10. But you put people in groups and then 7 out of 10 get it right. All it takes is for one person to spot the answer and explain it to everyone else, and they generally all fall in line. What do I mean by rationality promoting institutions? Well, there's science with its requirement for empirical testing and peer review, democratic governance with its checks and balances, journalism with its mechanisms of editing and fact-checking, our judicial system with its adversarial proceedings, and ideally academia with the commitments to freedom of inquiry and open debate, challenged though they currently are. Even Wikipedia works as well as it does because of the community of editors with a commitment to neutrality and objectivity. When it comes to digital media, it compares unfavorably to, say, Twitter and Facebook, where there are no such norms of fact-checking and commitment to accuracy, and we all know the results of that. It also means that the credibility and objectivity of rationality promoting institutions has to be safeguarded, because that's what stands between most of us and crazy beliefs. Experts should not just pronounce their conclusions as if they were oracles or priests, but should be prepared to show their work, that is, explain why they are advising what they are advising. The fallibility of experts should be acknowledged so that one mistake doesn't discredit them permanently. And gratuitous politicization should be avoided. When our institutions of science and academia and journalism conspicuously brand themselves as branches of the political left, they should not be so surprised when people who are on the political right blow them off. Finally, why does rationality matter? Well, it matters to our lives. people who follow the normative models and avoid cognitive fallacies, on average, get into fewer accidents and mishaps, have better financial, health, and employment outcomes, and are less likely to be swindled by medical and psychic charlatans. Again, this is a recurring theme of Skeptical Inquirer magazine and one of the raison d'etre for the Center for Inquiry. Second, rationality drives material progress. In my previous book, Enlightenment Now, I presented data showing that longevity, peace, prosperity, safety, and quality of life have all increased over time. Well, this leads to a frequently asked question: does this mean that you believe in progress? The answer is no. With the humorist Fran Lebowitz, I don't believe in anything you have to believe in. Progress comes when people deploy reason to improve human flourishing. Reality does not submit to our wishes. The universe does not care a whit for our well-being. The only way we make our lives better is if we outwit the universe and using reason and figure out better ways of getting the things that make people better off. Less obviously, I'm prepared to argue that rationality drives moral progress. In an earlier book, Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined, I not only showed that measures of violence such as war and genocide and slavery and lynchings and violence against women have declined over the decades and centuries, but somewhat to my surprise, I found that many of these movements began with a rational argument. Some philosopher or scholar or activist gave people a reason why one of their practices was inconsistent with a belief that they claimed to hold. The treatise or pamphlet or manifesto would be reprinted and translated, would go viral, as we say, would be debated in pubs and salons and coffee houses, would spill over to people in power and eventually become the law of the land. Let me give you some examples with chapter and verse. Did people need a rational argument as to why something might be a wee bit wrong with burning heretics at the stake? The answer is that they did, and it was provided, among others, by Sebastian Castellio in the 16th century, who wrote, "Calvin says that he is certain, and other sects say that they are. Who shall be judge? In view of the uncertainty, we must define the heretic simply as one with whom we disagree. And if then we're going to kill heretics, the logical outcome will be a war of extermination, since each is sure of himself." How about cruel and sadistic forms of corporal and capital punishment, like breaking on the wheel or clawing with iron hooks or disembowelment? Well, the utilitarian philosopher Cesare Beccaria stated the reason. As punishments become more cruel, the minds of men, which like fluids always adjust to the level of objects that surround them, become hardened. And after 100 years of cruel punishments, breaking on the wheel causes no more fear than imprisonment previously did. For a punishment to achieve its objective, it is only necessary that the harm that it inflicts outweighs the benefit that derives from the crime, and into this calculation ought to be factored the certainty of punishment and the loss of the good that the commission of the crime would produce. In other words, calculations of rational choice, expected utility. Everything beyond this is superfluous and therefore tyrannical. What about war? Did people need an argument that war is not healthy for children and other living things? Well, it was provided by Desiderius Erasmus, one of the founders of modernity. The advantages derived from peace, he wrote, diffuse themselves far and wide and reach great numbers. While in war, if anything turns out happily, the advantage redounds only to a few. One man's safety is owing to the destruction of another. One man's prize is derived from the plunder of another. The cause of rejoicings made by one side is to the other a cause of mourning. Whatever is unfortunate in war is severely so indeed, and whatever, on the contrary, is called good fortune is a savage and a cruel good fortune, an ungenerous happiness deriving its existence from another's woe, what today we would call a zero-sum game in the language of game theory. Autocracy. Did people need an argument against the divine right of kings and absolute monarchy? John Locke provided it. Freedom of men under government is to have a standing rule to live by, common to every one of that society, and made by the legislative power erected in it. A liberty to follow my own will in all things where that rule prescribes not to be subject to the inconstant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of another man, as freedom of nature is to be under no other restraint but the law of nature. An argument that eventually led to the American Declaration of Independence and the formation of democracies, quite predictably, but less predictably to another advance in human welfare, articulated by Mary Astell, the first English feminist, who wrote, in the 17th century, if absolute sovereignty be not necessary in a state, how comes it to be in a family? Or if in a family, why not in a state? Since no reason can be alleged for the one that will not hold more strongly for the other. If all men are born free, how is it that all women are born slaves? As they must be if the being subjected to the inconstant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of men, sound familiar, be the perfect condition of slavery. And speaking of slavery itself, it may be hard to reconstruct that this was actively debated in its time. We tend to agree with Abraham Lincoln that if slavery is not evil, nothing is evil. But the argument indeed was made, perhaps most powerfully, by Frederick Douglass, who wrote, there are 72 crimes in the state of Virginia, which if committed by a black man, subject him to the punishment of death, while only 2 of the same crimes will subject a white man to the like punishment. What is this but the acknowledgement that the slave is a moral, intellectual, and responsible being? The manhood of the slave is conceded. It is admitted in the fact that the Southern statute books are covered with enactments forbidding, under severe fines and penalties, the teaching of the slave to read or write. When you can point to any such laws in reference to the beasts of the field, then I may consent to argue the manhood of the slave. Not only has reason guided movements for change, but I would argue that reason should guide movements for change. They make the difference between moral force and brute force, between marches for justice and lynch mobs, between human progress and breaking things. And they'll be needed to ensure that moral progress will continue, that the barbaric practices of our time will come to be seen by our descendants as inconceivable as slavery and heretic burning are to us. Finally, I conclude in the book, the power of rationality to guide moral progress is of a piece with its power to guide material progress and wise choices in our lives. And I'll read the conclusion of the book. Our ability to eke increments of well-being out of a pitiless world and to be good to others despite our flawed nature depends on grasping impartial principles that transcend our parochial experience. We are a species that's been endowed with an elementary faculty of reason that has discovered formulas and institutions that magnify its scope. They awaken us to ideas and expose us to realities that confound our intuitions, but are true for all that. Thank you. Thank you, Leanne. Thank you, Skeptical Inquirer. Thank you, Center for Inquiry.
Stephen, thank you. Thank you so very much. That was amazing. This is why I miss having things in person, because I am sure this is at the points there would be thunderous applause for your presentation. Kind. There are lots of kudos here in the comments for your presentation and even its appearance. And yes, I add my voice to that as well. And thank you for being a longtime member of the organization, and for letting me know that I am not a creative genius by that way we measure that.
Even if people laugh at your ideas.
Yes, and your husband
people
and wife
should laugh
story.
at your people.
Yes, yeah, for me, yeah, they should be laughing, yes, for sure.
I hope so. Yes,
I hope so too. And for your husband and wife story had me laughing. I will admit to that. And yes, I think I need a new towel. Oh Oh my gosh, so many questions here, and I apologize because I tried to get to as many as possible. I do want to acknowledge one of our speaker alums here, someone who's presented here with us before, Guy Harrison. Yes, to answer your question, your very pressing question. Yes, these are dilithium crystals in my necklace. Thank you for noticing that, sir. They are not. I wish they were. But God, he does pose an interesting question just to get us kicked off here. He said, in light of the numerous problems with popular race categories as coherent genetic units of humankind, what are your thoughts about race and IQ? Many claim that group genetic intelligence can be scientifically ranked according to common cultural races. Do you agree or disagree with this? This feels like a bit of a gimme, but there you
Yeah.
go.
Yeah, no, I don't think that the evidence licenses that conclusion. We know, even though I do think that intelligence is a real thing, that
Yes.
it does predict positive life outcomes. It can be more or less measured. It is partly, though by no means completely heritable, but we also know that there are historical and sociological phenomena that can affect scores on intelligence tests. We know that, for example, immigrant groups almost uniformly score lower, and that the difference vanishes in a generation or two. We know that IQ scores have been rising over time, the so-called Flynn effect. We don't have the equivalent kind of tests that we have when it comes to gender differences. Say why I do think that some differences in personality, in sexuality, are between men and women on average have a biological basis. But that's because when it comes to sex, we can actually do experiments like see what happens to boys who are raised as girls, look to other species to see if there are similar sex differences. None of those are available when it comes to race, and so I think that there's no scientific evidence to go to genetics to explain racial differences.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You said that more eloquently than I would have. I was just bah humbug. Eric Sotnak, thank you for watching, Eric. There's a lot to his question, but it really just boils down to how can we promote information literacy in a way that prioritizes information quality? Because some people are they're well read, but what are they reading? What are their sources? So
exactly.
This was a great question.
It is, all too well read sometimes, because what a lot of the crackpots and conspiracy theories say is do the research on your own, and there'll be no shortage of stuff on the web and on YouTube that will ratify a belief, no matter how crazy. So it's and which leads to the question: how do we know anything about anything? Why should we trust science when we do trust them, or government record-keeping agencies or responsible journalists? The answer is that we shouldn't trust them in the sense of they're our guys and gals, or they're on our side. We trust them only to the extent that they can explain how they came to their conclusions, and moreover that they are willing to accept criticism and defend their conclusions against criticism, that they're part of a community of peer commentary, of free speech, of debate. And if an idea withstands attempts to criticize it, then that gives it a little more, it should give it a little more credence. It's communities that establish those rules, and sadly, many today are backing off from that, and we all know how freedom of speech, freedom of inquiry are being compromised, even in our scientific societies, our universities, our newspapers. That is a bad thing, because in order to answer that question, we have to have institutions that play by the rules, and the rules being, given that we all are biased, and we all are biased, how do we come to some collective conclusion that is not going to be biased the way each of us individually is? So we've got to safeguard and preserve the rules of the game.
Oh, so much personal work here to be done. And this is actually one of the running themes, not only in the questions here, but in some of our prior events. Because again, it'd be easy to just sort of exist in our own bubble, but there are people that we love, there are people that we work with, people that we congregate with, and how do we talk to folks? So this is I'm sort of combining a couple questions here from like Jennifer Herman and Joseph Bourquet, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. They're thanking you, of course, for your presentation, but how can we talk to the superstitious? How can we talk to the
Yeah.
irrational so that they listen or so that they hear?
Yeah, no, a very, indeed a poignant question. And and the question that I get is how do you convince someone that the 2020 election wasn't stolen, or that that there is no such thing as QAnon? In some cases, the answer is you can't. I mean, it might be like the question, how do you convince the Pope that Jesus was not the Son of God and the Savior? Well, probably give up on that. You can't
Yeah.
convince, yeah, you can't convince everyone of everything. And some people will just go to their graves believing things that are central to if they are central to their identity.
Yes.
Fortunately, not all of these beliefs are so central to people's identity. Sometimes people grow out of beliefs, especially when their ego is not on the line, when they aren't made to look like fools if they do. There are new babies being born every minute, and they aren't born believing in QAnon. And so one could present evidence that will prevent them from getting sucked in the first place. There are always people in kind of the gray zone, kind of sitting in the fence. They kind of, maybe they believe it, maybe they don't, and they can be picked off one at a time with good reason and arguments. And even for the true believers, some of them will, with the passage of time, it kind of sinks in that the belief is harder and harder to maintain, or that it conflicts with other beliefs that they can't deny. I have in the BBC podcast series, Think with Pinker,
Mhm.
I have a conversation with Ellen Cushing, writer and
Yes.
editor for The Atlantic, who herself was sucked into a conspiracy theory, the
Mhm.
Illuminati, when she was a
Yes.
teenager. She was absolutely convinced that there was a worldwide cabal of financiers and politicians who controlled the world economy. Growing up in Berkeley, of all places, then she kind of discovered that the Illuminati theory was highly anti-Semitic, and she kind of realized, well,
Mhm.
gee, that's really not cool. And that realization gave her some second thoughts. So the route out, and of course she was disabused and has written about her experience quite interestingly ever since. So not escalating the union of a belief with someone's identity, because the more it's kind of stands for everything they believe in, the less likely they'll give it up, the more likely they are to rationalize away any finding. But maybe to chip at it from the outside, to respectfully bring up, ask, how do you know? Is there anything that would change your mind? How do you compare it with other
Mhm.
people who seem totally sure of their belief? Again, with no guarantee of success.
Right. We've had. Thank you for tackling that. It seems to come up almost every presentation, and unfortunately, the answer is always there's no quick fix to this. We can't Twitter our way out of this. There's no 240 character answer. It takes time and patience and compassion and curiosity, and we seem to be in short supply of that. But then what's the alternative? How else do we pass the time here on the planet?
Indeed, I
So
think,
thank
and
you.
I think we have to try, if only to perhaps create cracks in a belief system that could
Yes.
widen to reach the people who have not drunk the Kool-Aid yet, or who are already on the fence. So I think
Mhm.
the reasoned case has to be made. We have, of course, do it by example. We ourselves can't use force to shut people up, but persuade as best we can, to show how we ourselves came to our beliefs, so that we
Mhm.
aren't isn't just warring dogmas. Anyway, but you're absolutely right. There isn't a quick fix.
Yeah, and it's funny. I actually heard that episode of your podcast,
Oh, you did? Okay.
with your guest, and we didn't go to the same school, but I too was sort of introduced to the idea of the Illuminati when I was a teenager, and I think it hooks you because you're still young enough to think grown-ups know what they're doing. And
Yeah.
then you become a grown up and you realize how completely incompetent most of us are. It's like, no one's driving the bus, everybody.
That
It's not that organized.
Man, that is such an important adult realization that it is
Very
very that
frightening.
it's frightening. It's also somewhat reassuring that a lot of these
Yes.
conspiracies, we're just not. No one is smart enough to carry them off.
Yeah, no one's putting in this kind of time, you guys. They're
Yeah,
just not.
and you're not going to have thousands of people loyal enough to the cause that not one of them will ever screw up, not one of them will ever
No.
blurt something out, not one of them will ever be victim of a sting, not one of them will ever defect or get sick of the whole thing. Just no one can no one can really run a conspiracy that well.
No. And when they do, it's usually a movie.
It's usually a movie, exactly. Yeah,
Like,
it's
why does this
only in
feel
the
familiar?
movies.
Because you watched it on Netflix, everybody. That's why. Don't look up. Oh goodness. Peter has. I know we're running close to time here, so I want to try to get in a few more questions if that's okay. Peter Roloff, if I'm saying that correctly, wants to know: do you see any trends toward rational thinking education being blocked in the last few years? Because we all think that this is important, but do you see people actively fighting against this?
Oh,
I'm gonna
absolutely. Sadly, the
yeah.
but the in well, certainly in universities where a heterodox opinion, a heresy, can get someone canceled and leave, especially the people who are less powerful, the instructors, the assistant professors, the adjuncts, in terror of losing their jobs. We've got the imposition of highly tendentious curricula in high schools and elementary schools that demand one particular interpretation of American history and punish anyone who dissents from it. There are, of course, there have long been attempts to impose creationist and religious curricula in schools. They've been batted down by the courts, but they keep popping up. There are attempts to ban books that are a kind of constant background hum to American education. So yeah, it's a, to use one of the cliches, it's a lawn that constantly has to be mowed.
All right. Thank you. I wish there were a better answer than that. I mean, not that you gave a bad answer, but
No,
that,
no, I
you
just,
gave the honest
yeah.
answer, and I thank you for that. Uh, how okay, I'll try to answer this. Given the four causes of irrational behavior you listed, such as motivated reasoning, et al., what makes you think there's any hope for reason to win out?
Oh, because of the trends in human progress that I discussed, the fact that we've we really have developed drought-resistant crops and synthetic fertilizer and granaries and crop rotation instead of praying to the gods and sacrificing virgins for better harvest. We even with all of the, what is it, 30,000 lies that Donald Trump told, not a single one involved astrology, paranormal, crystal healing. By and large, people take their kids to doctors rather than faith healers or exorcists. People no longer believe in werewolves and unicorns and bloodletting, by and large.
By
Some
and
do.
large, I was about to say, depending
Some
on the
do.
corner of the internet you're hanging out on.
Well, true enough. But there are, a couple of hundred years ago, the reading omens into eclipses and comets would have been respectable. At least in mainstream reasoning, all of these have receded, and a more scientific outlook has kind of become second nature. We often don't notice it when it has because we're so attuned to the exceptions. But the fact that we're living longer, that there are fewer famines, fewer wars, less racism, less poverty than there used to be. There's still all of those things, of course, and we want to bring them down to zero. But the fact that there has been success suggests that reason can nibble away and make inroads.
Thank you very much. This is an interesting question, I guess, very in the moment. Thank you, Catherine Francis. Do you think it's rational to continue to legislate COVID-19 lockdowns in the face of evidence that only a very small percentage of people infected with COVID-19 face serious illness or death? Where should the government draw the line? Have I just added a whole hour to this conversation and I didn't mean to?
A full answer would, but a partial answer. I agree with the premise that there should
Okay.
be, I talked about the theory of expected utility of rational choice, and of signal detection, of comparing the costs of overreacting and underreacting, of hits and false alarms in making a rational
Mhm.
choice. And as much as I am in favor of vigorous public health measures to deal with the pandemic, particularly vaccination, but before having kind of reflexive lockdowns, the costs and benefits really should be costed out and justified by public health agencies. I think just saying, trust us, we're doctors or we're public health experts, has not been a good solution, either in convincing people of the credibility of the public health establishment or in terms of sound policy. We really should lock down only to the extent that the costs are outweighed by the benefits. It is a completely reasonable question.
I will sum that up as adulting is hard. It is, I don't envy anybody in these decision-making roles. This is tough stuff. Jim Burns, I want to end on this question, just because I know there's light here. Do you see any examples of universities or other schools which are becoming more effective at teaching rationality skills? I asked you about, whether they were, things that were being suppressed, and you did elaborate on that. But do you see some hope there? Are there places that are doing it right or trying to do it better?
Yes, well, the University of Chicago, about 5 years ago, articulated a set of principles for free inquiry and academic freedom, which have been adopted by another 60 or so universities, as far as I know. Sadly, not Harvard, but I'm going to lobby that they do. There are, in a lot of universities, courses in cognitive science, psychology, and behavioral economics, and logic, and requirements of quantitative and statistical thinking. Not as much as they should. And in fact, again, close to home, my own attempt to get Harvard to adopt a requirement in statistical and critical thinking fell dead-born from my lips. So not enough. There are some, but not enough.
Okay. Stephen, again, I cannot tell you how much I was looking forward to this, and I thank you for your time, your expertise, the quality of your presentation. Again, I am so jealous of your setup. It's like, how do I do that? That would be awesome. I might have to send you an email to ask. Maybe I need Harvard, as my to call on. But I do thank you, and I want to remind folks that if you missed any of this presentation, this recording will be available tomorrow at skepticalinquirer.org. And if you just want to hear some of this again, because there was a lot of good information here, I think it's worth the rewatching, to be honest with you. But it'll be available tomorrow. And by all means, please join us back here on January 20th for our next Skeptical Inquirer Presents. And as always, I would want to give my thanks to Skeptical Inquirer, to the Center for Inquiry, and our producer in the background, Mark Kreidler. Thank you. I could not do this without you. And of course, my biggest thanks to you, the audience, for choosing to spend your time with us this hour. We appreciate that as well. My name is Leanne Lord, CSI Fellow now, and thank you and good night. Thanks again, Stephen. You were fantastic. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
As you were, Leanne, you're a tough act to follow. Thank you so much for being willing to introduce me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, so do I. Be well.
You too.